May I ask for your attention, please? I don't think the mic is working. I hope that you can hear me well in the last rows. If you need to come closer. Well, welcome to the last lecture in our series, Religion, Divisions, and Social Changes. It's my great joy to have today one of the leading Orthodox theologians today, Dr. Cyril Hovorun from LA, Marymount Loyola University, and acting director of Huffington Institute in LA. Now, it's a bit puzzling to have a lecture, Evil and Freedom, from somebody who is very much involved in church politics for the last 15 years. He picked up a topic which is more philosophical and kind of theological than kind of political in this sense of church policy. But you can see very clearly this intention in his works, and especially in his trilogy published from 2015, 3 books, Meta-Ecclesiology, then the Scaffolds of the Church, and the last, Political Orthodoxies, where he is actually trying to see how the modern ecclesiology and ecclesial policy in the world works, and he's comparing this with the fundaments of Orthodox theology, which is mainly identified with a philosophy of Christian Platonism or Christian Neoplatonism. Now we have a topic, Evil and Freedom. He's starting from the position of Christian Neoplatonism, which is also a doctrine adopted from pagan Platonism, that evil, that good is the fullness of being, and that evil is lack of this fullness. Then when Christian theologians and philosophers adopted this, they identified God with fullness of being and fullness of goodness, and what is evil with the lack of this goodness and lack of this being. And then if we put in this perspective the question of, or this kind of problem of evil should be seen in ontological and as an ontological perspective. Now, but he's pushing this further on, working with in the church politics in the last 15 years, I would say. He experienced a lot of divisions among churches. He experienced a lot of things which characterize modern churches as nationalism, anti-Semitism, and he tried to put in this perspective of freedom and evil, identifying this not with a kind of social phenomena of modern society, but with ecclesial heresies, which can be put among the other heresies on the early church, which is connected with the doctrine of Trinity or hypostasis of Christ. And today he's going to tell us something in this perspective, connecting actually on one side these fundaments of Christian Neoplatonism or Christian Platonism, where evil is lack of goodness, but also lack of being, with the other side of the spectrum, with the question of modern ecclesial problems. Before I give him word, I would like to say that I'm especially honored to have him, because we are friends for almost 20 years. We studied a long time ago in Durham, in UK, having the same teacher and same supervisor, and since then we have the kind of different paths, and Cyril was for 15 years on a high position in Russian Orthodox Church, being a monk, archimandrite. He worked closely with the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, and Metropolitan Hilarion, and since the how say kind of Russian intervention in Ukraine, he's not anymore involved in church politics. He pursued a completely academic career, having several first teaching in Ignatius Theological School in Stockholm, then moving to the States, having several fellowships at Yale, at Columbia, Alberta University. Now he's, apart from being a professor, assistant professor in LA, in Marymount Loyola University. He's also visiting professor in Germany, in Münster, and he is very active in different theological and philosophical forums. Now, as I said, he's the author of first of his book is in about 6th and 7th century heresies, published with Brill. But I would say that the last three books, at least ecclesial trilogy or trilogy and ecclesiology, are kind of probably the best contribution in ecclesiology in the last 20, 30 years. And I'm very glad that he is here, and I would like to ask him to present his lecture. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you so much, Vladimir, for the presentation, for your nice words. Indeed, we are friends now for, indeed, I don't remember how many years. And I'm glad to be here again with the invitation from this institute. It's my pleasure, it's my privilege to be in Belgrade. I came here, unfortunately, just for one day, and the purpose is to present on evil and freedom. This is one of those big questions that are sometimes lost when we discuss smaller questions. At the same time, I think the general topic on evil and freedom is directly connected well, to politics, if you want, to the church politics. The long experience in church politics, well, invites you to think about evil and about the origins of evil. Something that the theologians have explored extensively, and something that occurs in the church as well. So I decided to pick up a topic of more general interest. Usually I present when I'm invited. I present on those small things related to church politics or just politics in general. But well, Belgrade inspired me to think larger, bigger, and to explore the issue of evil. It doesn't mean that I will ignore the current issues. I'll try to make some projections to the current situation, and certainly in the Q&A that will follow, we could discuss maybe more particular issues. So let me go straight to the core of the problem. I would identify two basic interpretations of the nature of evil. I would identify them as ontological and as ethical. Well, ontological means, as philosophers know, something related to the things, and comes from the Greek word taonda, the things. An ontological interpretation of evil would be the one that sees the evil as embodied in things, sometimes even material things, or in metaphysical things, in social realities. So from this perspective, evil is something that you can touch, something that you can feel, something that you can even taste if you want. Something which is real, something which is objective, which does not depend on you, which does not depend on others. It's a sort of objective reality. Originally, this ontological interpretation of evil, because I believe it is really a diachronic interpretation. It began in the ages about which we don't remember, and continues even now. And in the ages, prehistoric even ages, the ages that we don't remember, evil was interpreted, the ontological interpretation of evil would put evil to the scale of matter. Evil was perceived as something materialized, as something that you can touch. As the humankind developed, the idea of ontological evil also got updated. We always have updates of the concept of ontological evil. Nowadays, I believe this interpretation of evil can be seen in some vicious social theories. Sometimes I explain to my students in my class, I teach Eastern Christian traditions to my students in California, and I explain to them that this ontological interpretation of evil can be seen in the modern American developments like racism. When you see the people of different color, in your perception, are ethically different from the people of another color, of white color, for instance, that is exactly an ontological interpretation of evil. Or when you see a gender, say women, being different from males, and you take this differentiation between genders as a differentiation between more and less degree of evil. In other words, when you see women as incarnation, as embodiment of evil, that is an ontological interpretation of evil. This sexism, this misogynic approach to women is exactly a modern continuation, a modern update to this old ontological interpretation of evil. When you see other social groups as being evil by the fact of belonging to a social group, like homosexuals, right? You see them as an incarnation then of evil. That is another interpretation of ontological interpretation of evil. Coming closer to our own kind of setting, nationalism is another instance, I believe, of this ontological interpretation of evil. When you see your own national group, ethnic group as ontologically good and all others, especially neighbors, as ontologically bad, that is exactly an ontological interpretation of evil. So even though those old theories about evil, ontological theories about evil, are really old, and many of them have been forgotten, they still exist and they take different forms and shapes in our time. Therefore, I believe it is important to go back to the roots and to understand the origins of this exact interpretation of evil. The basic idea behind this interpretation, ontological interpretation of evil, is dualistic. It sees the world in black and white. It sees the world as partially good and partially bad. The bad part of the world was made, was created, was or became bad, and it's an objective reality, as I said. This looking at the world as black and white, as good and bad, is this polarization of the world is actually, we can trace this polarization as far as in Plato, I believe. Even though Plato himself was not a dualistic philosopher, of course, but he reflected his philosophy, and of course Socrates and the pre-Socratic tradition, they reflected some perceptions of the world which were widely spread, obviously. And I would say that the very counterposition of the world of the matter and the world of the ideas that Plato introduced has to do with this polarization of the world. Again, even though it was not exactly dualistic in the sense that we would identify later on, the very counterposition or differentiation between the visible world and the world of ideas introduces us somehow, or reminds us of this interpretation of the world around us as divided between two parts. The later interpreters of Plato, some of them would take it this polarization between, or differentiation between the visible and invisible world as exactly a pretext, an excuse to identify the evil parts of the world. Such was the Gnostic interpretation of the world, of which you probably heard. From the Gnostic perspective, which was based on Platonism, on later Platonism, the world would be divided into two parts. The matter would be identified as essential, as ontological evil, and the ideas were identified as essential good, as something which is essentially good. Again, Plato, of course, neither the Middle Platonists nor the Neoplatonists, of whom we will be speaking later, they did not take the differentiation between the ideas and the matter, the visible and invisible world. They didn't take it in dualistic sense, that the world is divided between ontologically good and ontologically bad parts. But some interpreters of Plato, like Gnostics, like Manichaeans later on, would see this differentiation between the ideas and the matter as an excuse and as a pretext, as I said, to see the world polarized as black and white. So let me dwell more on this Gnostic and later on Manichaean understanding of the world. According to this interpretation of the world, it had two principles, two beginnings. The one of them would be God, and God created the good part of the world. The other one would be the opposite to God. Well, sometimes he was called a demiurge, or an evil beginning in the world, and this was the source of the bad part, of the spoiled, of the evil part of the world. So this interpretation, black and white interpretation of the world, divided into good and bad parts, would originate from two beginnings. One was good and another one was bad. Also, they would see, sometimes they would see the polarization between the spiritual and the material as exactly the division line between the good and bad, where spiritual was good and material was bad. Sometimes they saw this division within the material world. So some Gnostic movements, or some dualistic movements, even before Gnosticism, would divide the entire world into good and bad parts. That would identify areas in this world as essentially, intrinsically bad, and some spots in these areas as essentially, intrinsically good. Particularly interesting in this regards was a Montanistic movement, a movement that emerged in the 3rd century in Asia Minor, in Phrygia, and which identified a place in Asia Minor which was clean, which was good by definition, by being placed in this part of the world, while the rest of the world was regarded as intrinsically, ontologically bad. I actually had a chance to visit that place. It was discovered relatively recently in in the beginning of 2000s by two scholars, one from the United States and another from Germany. They did, they heard the testimonies. We had sources speaking about the this Montanistic, what they called New Jerusalem, a place which was specially chosen, which was cleansed up, which was freed from any influence, impact of evil. And they created a settlement in that place. So we know from sources about those dwellings. Those were cities actually called Pepuza and Timion, two cities or villages, whatever you call them, to settlements, and we knew about them. And only recently, as I said, in the 2000s, the scholars had a chance to discover this place, and They used some modern techniques like magnetic scanning of the territory, and they found actually the settlements, the original settlements, and they began excavations there. But those excavations are still not very much advanced. When I visited them a couple of years ago, it was still like a place where no one goes. It was an interesting, there were some interesting circumstances. I wanted to go there. I went to a village nearby, and I tried to ask, local people, can you lead me there? Because I assumed that because it has been publicized widely, this place, people would go there and see, the montanistic place, the only montanistic place that exists in the world, that they found in the world. And the local people, well, they hardly spoke any language, of course, except Turkish. I used my Google Translator to communicate with them. They didn't know where it is, just in the village nearby. Only one taxi driver, suggested how to go there, and eventually we went there, and it was completely deserted. And it was really also fascinating to see, those beautiful hills. And this place was located on the side of one of those hills, and there was no difference. Actually, that place was really kind of wild and and ugly against the beauty of the surrounding nature. And you understand that for the people, for the Montanists at that time, this ugly place was the only clean, holy, exempt place of goodness, of embodied goodness, while the rest of the world, this beautiful nature around it, they considered it, perceived it as ontologically bad, as evil, as the incarnation of evil. You better don't touch it because you get, contaminated. You got really, you get in touch with the ontological evil, with demons, and the only place where you can be safe is exactly this spot on the hill, where you can feel safe. You feel like protected from the evils of the world. That's how this consciousness of dualistic consciousness that divides the world into black and white works, and it is really strange. It is really paradoxical. My own experience, my own way of seeing it was, you see this beauty of nature around it, even though Phrygia is not a particularly beautiful kind of region of Asia Minor, but still it is beautiful, relatively. And for them, it was ugly, it was bad, it was evil. And this relatively kind of ugly place in the middle of this beauty, for them, it was the incarnation of goodness. It was something very special. So that was this dualistic mentality, how it worked. And a lot of people were infected by this mentality. Sometimes in softer ways, milder ways, sometimes in more radical ways. Well, Montanists, then Manichaeans, certainly they were more radical in their perception of this division between evil and bad. But there were softer, milder versions of this perception, like in monasticism. In some areas, in some traditions, monastic traditions, we see the same way of thinking and seeing the things. I can tell this to you as being myself a monastic, so I know it from inside, that indeed some monastic traditions adopted some soft versions of dualistic worldview, perception of the world, in their own interpretation of their lifestyle, of the incarnation. If you take, for instance, the monastic circles around Constantinople in the 5th century, they were certainly affected by this dualistic worldview. And this dualistic worldview being incarnated in the monastic communities around Constantinople, this is one of the cases, but not the only one case. Those circles who were led by a guide, by an archimandrite, a person in charge of those monastic communities whose name was Eutychus, Ftihis. Those circles arrived at a special perception of the incarnation. According to this perception, When God became incarnated in the person of Jesus Christ, God found the human nature which he had adopted incompatible with divinity. Because this human nature that was adopted by God in the person of Jesus Christ was essentially, ontologically affected by evil. If not the incarnation of evil per se, it was contaminated profoundly to the very roots of its existence. Its essence, its very nature was alienated by evil. And therefore, when God became man, when God adopted this human nature had to be changed in order to be purified, to be united with God. Otherwise, it remained incompatible with divinity. Therefore, they began thinking about the incarnation in terms of alienation, that the human nature that Christ had was very different, radically different from our human nature. Otherwise, it could not coexist with the divinity. And they arrived at a doctrine which we nowadays know as monophysitism or Eutychianism, a doctrine that was condemned at the Fourth Ecumenical Council in Chalcedon. But the origins of this doctrine, of Eutychianism, of monophysitism, is exactly dualistic. And it exactly reflected the dualistic tendencies in the monastic communities in that area around Constantinople. So it was not, they were not Manichaeans, they were not agnostics, they were monks, but they essentially followed the line of the ontological interpretation of evil. And as I said, it was one of the cases, but not the only case. We find the same tendencies in Egypt, we find the same tendencies in Palestine, we find the same tendencies in the West, in some Western monastic communities, and in some social groups and communities in the West, like Cathars, for instance, kind of pseudo-gnostic movements in the West. So it's indeed an eternal movement, a perennial movement that continues through different ages and has different iterations, different forms, but it continues and reproduces itself. And as I said, it has reached our times in the forms of racism, nationalism, anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, well, I forgot to mention it. It's probably one of the most outrageous incarnation of this ontological interpretation of evil, because the Jews were perceived as the incarnation, as the utmost incarnation of evil from the perspective of Nazis, at least. And so this is not a new thing. It had some interesting precedents in the past. So that was kind of the line, and the line. Now I want to come to the remedy of this tendency of this line. It came from Neoplatonic philosophy, from a very interesting synthesis between Christianity and Neoplatonic philosophy, what we call Christian Neoplatonism. It is a controversial synthesis. It is a controversial phenomenon, I believe. I personally don't like very much Christian Neoplatonism because it has introduced a lot of bad things to the church, I believe. Like, for instance, I believe that the principle of hierarchy was introduced to the church through Neoplatonism. Because before the 5th century, I made a study of this, I made a research. Before the 5th century, we don't find the word hierarchy in the church lexicon, in the church vocabulary. Even the concept as such was not very much known in the Christian circles. It was adopted from the Neoplatonic philosophy. And the person who made most to create the synthesis between Neoplatonism and Christianity is the person whom we don't know. We don't know his name, we know only his nickname or pen name, Dionysius the Areopagite. Still the scholars debate who was the guy, and he's probably one of the most mysterious, one of the most enigmatic figures in the patristic literature, because we don't know the guy. Who was he? We can assume that he lived probably in Syria, but it's not for sure. There are some interesting theories who could be the guy who were the real persons who wrote down this name, but still the scholars debate who was he. Certainly he was not Dionysius the Areopagite who lived in the first century. He was the guy who lived in the 5th century. But again, he is not identifiable. It's interesting, there are still scholars who believe that he was actually the guy who lived in the 1st century, which is nonsense. But yes, he's one of the most enigmatic figures in the Christian theology, and he was the one who exactly facilitated the synthesis between Christianity and Neoplatonism. So the bad thing about, I believe it's my personal opinion, about this Neoplatonic synthesis was that it reduced the principle of hierarchy to the church, and it made hierarchy ontological. It's another kind of ontological gameplay in theology and philosophy. When the principle of hierarchy was taken from the Neoplatonic philosophy by Dionysius, particularly, he actually adopted the scheme of gods in Proclus. Proclus has produced his own theology where he placed deities, gods. Proclus was a convinced polytheist. He believed in many gods. He was a very good Greek and Roman, very pious one, and he believed in many gods. And he actually sorted out those gods into a hierarchical system. He produced a system, very sophisticated one, and this system was borrowed by Dionysius. There are some, well, Dionysius in this sense was a plagiarist. He just plagiarized this Proclean system of gods and extrapolated this system onto the Christian theology. The only thing that he did, he preserved monotheism. So he placed the one God on the top of that hierarchy, and then he placed angels, different angelic strata to the system, which was to the matrix, which had been produced by Proclus. And what Dionysius did was exactly to make the hierarchy of angels, and then the ecclesial hierarchy, the hierarchy of bishops, priests, monks, and so forth, ontological. That they are not just, the relations of convenience. Those hierarchs in the church, they are not just because it is convenient, it is kind of comfortable for the church to have them, to make them functioning in the way of, to administer the church in the way in which the church can be administered in the best way. But they are hierarchs, senior hierarchs, less hierarchs, because it is like divine order. By the divine order, they have been installed to their positions by God Himself, and they cannot be moved from those positions except by God Himself. Let me put it in this way as well. The hierarchy of church hierarchs, patriarchs, bishops, popes, priests in the parish is a certain order. And according from the perspective of this Christian Neoplatonism, which had been produced by Dionysius, this order is divine. In the Latin theology, they have the phrase "ius divinum," the divine right. So this order exists by the divine right. This perception of the hierarchical order exists with the same strength both in the East and in the West. In the Western Christianity, we know this order as papacy. They believe that the Pope is a divine institution which exists by ius divinum, and the Pope is the mediator between God and human beings, and that is the only institution in the Church which exists by the divine right from the Western perspective. You can doubt anything except this position of the Pope in the Church hierarchy. In the East, we of course we reject papacy. We say no Pope, no, he cannot be the representative of God. But we believe in many popes. So for us, every patriarch, every bishop has the same position. He is there because of ius divinum, because of the divine right. So instead of one kind of pope, we have multiple popes, and we perceive the position of those bishops and priests in the same way as the Catholics perceive the position of the Pope in the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. And both perceptions of hierarchy are ontological. Both of them, they go back to Dionysius, to Pseudo-Dionysius, to the 5th century, to this marriage between Neoplatonism and Christian theology and church practice. At the same, and that is the controversial part of the Neoplatonic synthesis with Christianity. The good thing about it is that actually tackled the issue of ontological evil. It gave a solution to this seemingly inevitable interpretation of evil as being embodied, materialized in things around us. Because Pseudo-Dionysius, who faced the problem of the ontological interpretation of evil, and he apparently felt that it is wrong, it cannot be like that. He gave his own, the dilemma for Pseudo-Dionysius was essentially the following: that even if evil can be embodied in the world around us, then evil is something which is on the same scale with goodness. That evil has the same power, the same strength as goodness, which means that the evil beginning, the evil origins, the evil principle in the world is as powerful as God Himself, which was unacceptable for a Christian theologian, for a Christian thinker. And he suggested another solution to this dilemma, that evil does not exist. Evil does not exist, at least in the same sense as the things which had been created by God exist. That evil cannot be materialized, that evil cannot be embodied, that evil exists only as a virtual reality, even though, of course, they didn't use this phrase at the time, but we can use this phrase, that the evil for Dionysius, for the Neoplatonic, this Neoplatonic line, was a virtual reality, an imagined construct, something that exists in the mind, something that exists somewhere elsewhere, not in the material world. And Dionysius has effectively spared the material world from evil, from being affected, contaminated by evil. He said that we cannot even say that evil exists, because existence is something which can be touched, which can be materialized. And this verb, iparchion, does not apply to evil. Only it applies only to good things, to the things that had been created by God, to the things that exist. Things that don't exist cannot be iparchion. They cannot. We cannot use the verb exist to evil. And even though Dionysius did not suggest a proper verb to describe the mode of existence of evil, it has been kind of interpreted recently how it could be, what kind of verb could be used for that. I remember a modern Greek philosopher who reflected very much on Dionysius, Christos Yanaras, in his works, in his interpretation of Dionysius. He uses, and he's a great player with the Greek language. He really enjoys, Greek language, and he does amazing things with the Greek language. He I think, coined the verb midenizete in application to evil. That this phenomenon of evil doesn't exist, but it exists in the way that it doesn't exist. Miden is nothing. Well, miden is like nihil in Latin. Midenismos is nihilism. And if you produce a verb from this word, nothing, in America they like to use nouns as verbs. In English, and American English, they would say the evil does nothing. Well, to nothing. To make a noun to the verb. That's exactly what Yanaras means by midenizete. Evil nothings. Well, not exists but nothings. So that was the point of Dionysius, that the evil doesn't exist, it cannot be touched, it cannot be felt, it cannot be approached in the way as material things are approached. And this was a great solution to the problem of dualism, how to spare the world from being associated ontologically with evil. I call it a great moral revolution. It revolutionized our theories about ethics, about morality. Morality is not anymore something that depends on the things around us and does not depend on us. Morality is something that depends completely on us, on what we decide, on what we do, on what we decide to do. This moral revolution, a very positive moral revolution, we owe it to, I believe, to Pseudo Dionysius, and more largely because he was not the only figure in the Christian Neoplatonism, to the Christian Neoplatonics of the period of late antiquity. So on the one hand, Dionysius ontologized hierarchy, things that have affected, the church, the larger societies for a long time. On the other hand, he liberated the world from the necessity of being associated with evil. He de-ontologized evil per se. He ontologized hierarchy on the one hand. On the other hand, he de-ontologized evil. And quite surprisingly, in the Middle Ages, they came together again, because the hierarchization of the church and of the society led to a lot of evils in the, especially in the medieval society. It came to, well, the entire structure of the world in the period that followed the late antiquity, when this kind of these shifts happened. So in the Middle Ages, the church, the society, and they were perceived as one thing at the time, became ontologically hierarchical. It led to a very strong stratification of both the church and the society. The world was perceived in the Pseudo-Dionysian way as a hierarchy of things, and this hierarchy of things was projected to the hierarchy, the social hierarchies. They had very kind of rigid political systems, as you know, with the monarchs on the top. Well, in the West, it was actually the Pope who achieved this higher position, prime position in this hierarchy. Then the kings, then the layers of the medieval society, which were very rigidly, strictly stratified, and you could not escape from this stratified system of the society. So this development, social development, owed to Pseudo Dionysius. On the other hand, as I said, the Christian Neoplatonism liberated the Christian ethics from dualism, and actually it affected many people. One of the most probably prominent examples of this liberation from a dualistic worldview was Augustine in the West. Augustine, who had been Manichaean originally, he became Christian with the dualistic perception that world is black and white, that a part of the world is ontologically evil, is ontologically bad. And this was an idea that haunted him for many years, and he could not find an escape from it. And only after he began reading Neoplatonic works, Augustine arrived at the idea that probably world is not really that ontologically bad, and he arrived at a new concept of the evil being nested in the human freedom, not in the material world, but in the human freedom. And this passage, this personal moral revolution for Augustine, when he passed from the concept of evil being embedded in the material world to the concept of evil being embedded in the material world, to the concept of evil being embedded in the human choice, in the human freedom, this revolutionary shift produced one of the greatest moral thinkers at least in the Western philosophy. Augustine was such a person, and all these beautiful reflections on sin, on virtue, on goodness, on evil that we find in his confessions, in those endless volumes of his theological treatises. I believe they owe to this momentum, to this quantum leap from the ontological perception of evil to the moral perception of evil. And we come now to the second, I don't know how many times do we have, just tell me when I need to stop. So this moral perception of evil that Augustine elaborated upon in his works constituted an alternative to the ontological perception of evil. According to this moral perception of evil, evil, as I said, is nested not in the nature, but in the human free choice, free will. I should say that yes, we use the word free will as a phrase, as a concept, quite often, but we, I think, confuse at least two things in this concept: freedom and will. At least in the late antiquity, they were perceived in very different ways. Will was considered a faculty of the human nature, which is intrinsic to the human nature, something like mind, like soul, something like body, something like legs, or arms or heads, something which belongs to the human nature intrinsically and which cannot be alienated from the human nature. The freedom, the will, was not something which was concentrated in the human personality, in the human individuality. It's something which was concentrated, which belonged to the human commonality, to the commonality of all human beings. In the Aristotelian terms, in the terms of the Aristotelian logics, dialectics, will belonged to the nature, to the common nature of the human beings. And as such, will was spared from being affected by evil. In which sense? I need to mention in this regards, make a kind of footnote regarding a movement which became popular in the 7th century, the movement which is known as monothelitism. It was a doctrine which somehow succeeded the monophysitic line of doctrines. I studied it, actually. It was the subject of my dissertation at Durham. I wrote a dissertation on monothelitic movement in the 7th century. Let me just say a few words about this movement, because it's important for understanding of both the problem of ontological evil and of the problem of freedom. Essentially, the monothelites, it was a movement, it was a doctrine constructed for political reasons in the 7th century in order to bridge the groups of the Christians who had accepted the Chalcedonian Council of Chalcedon in 451, which stated that Christ had two natures. And those groups of Christians who did not accept that Christ had two natures, they insisted that Christ has one nature, and they opposed the Council of Chalcedon in 451, and they formed eventually the group of the churches which we now know as Oriental churches. The churches like Armenian, Coptic, Syrian, Ethiopian, they belong to that group of churches nowadays, and they are different from the Byzantine churches, including the Serbian church, which follow the line of Chalcedon. So there was a split, there had been a split between those two groups. And in order to bridge this split, Byzantine Emperor Heraclius constructed a theory, a doctrine, which was eclectic, which was which mechanically combined the elements from two doctrines. According to Heraclius, and he was supported by some theologians, Christ had one hypostasis, two natures, which was the reference to Chalcedon, to the Council of Chalcedon, and one will. One will, this concept of one will had to please the non-Chalcedonian groups, because they didn't like the idea of two natures, of course, but they liked the idea of one will and one energy. Energy was another thing that was discussed in the 7th century. So according to monothelitic doctrine, Christ had one hypostasis, two natures, and one will. That was done mechanically in order to bridge the non-Chalcedonian and Chalcedonian groups of Christians at the time. But it had some interesting philosophical implications, this concept. Because from the perspective of the advocates of this doctrine, some theologians supported this doctrine, and they argued that Christ could have only one will, and this will was divine, because the human will was contaminated by evil. Therefore, Christ could not have human will. And they argued that because human will is affected by evil, it is bad, essentially, ontologically bad. It cannot be a part of the human nature of Christ. The arguments of the other side, non-monothelite, the diothelite side, including Maximus the Confessor. Vladimir is a good specialist on Maximus the Confessor, and he's one of the greatest theologians and philosophers of, well, probably of the entire first millennium, Christian millennium. The point of this group was that no, the human will of Christ is not intrinsically bad. It is good, and it belongs to the nature of Christ. Therefore, in Christ there were two wills, the divine one, which no one denied, and the human will. And that was the point of the Diothelites, and they eventually prevailed at the Sixth Ecumenical Council, and now we are all, well, even if we don't know, we are Diothelites. At least those who are Christians and Orthodox Christians, they are Diothelites because they believe that Christ had two wills. Well, the point of disagreement between the Monothelites and Diothelites in the 7th century was exactly about the nature of will. Whether it is intrinsically bad, affected by evil, it is contaminated, alienated by evil, or it is intrinsically good, and therefore it is a part of the human nature of Christ. Effectively, monothelitism continued the line of the dualists, of all those generations of philosophers and theologians who interpreted evil as ontologically existent, as a thing. For the monothelites, essentially, the human will was a part of this evil plot against humanity. It was a part of this evil setting that exists in the parallel reality, that exists in parallel to the good things, to the good world. And when Maximus, being a Neoplatonist, Maximus was a Neoplatonist, a Christian Neoplatonist, when other theologians, John of Damascus, who was another Christian Neoplatonist, when they argued against the will being affected, alienated by evil, and advocated for the human will in Christ, they essentially advocated for the pure kind of Christian Neoplatonic perception of the things around us as ontologically good. It was the same struggle, the same argument between those who believe in evil as an ontological category and those who believe that evil is a moral category. Okay? And, well, fortunately, I believe fortunately for us, the faction that argued for the moral nature of evil won over the faction that argued for the ontological character nature of evil. Therefore, human will, was kind of regarded as a part of the human nature, liberated from evil as such. For Maximus and his confederates, evil nested elsewhere in the freedom, in the way how people choose, how they take decisions. And it's quite interesting that simultaneously with the arguments about the nature of evil, with the arguments about the nature of will, there was a discussion, an ongoing discussion, evolving discussion about the nature of freedom. And at that time, it's 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. A lot of theologians, what we call the fathers of the church, arrived at very interesting ideas about freedom as such. And Again, I should say that they differentiated between the category of will and category of freedom, and they even had differentiations within the category of freedom. They essentially had two words for freedom. What we now call freedom, in the Greek fathers, they had two words. One word was eleftheria, and another word was avtexousion, to avtexousion. Usually, they translate in English these two words with the same word, freedom. Well, the same applies to the Slavonic languages. In Russian, they would translate svoboda. Both words would be svoboda. For the Greeks, though, there was a huge difference between them. To avtexousion is something that is intrinsic, that belongs to the human, to the very core of the human nature. To avtexousion is something that cannot be taken from me. This is a kind of freedom which is unerasable from me, which cannot be suppressed, which cannot be quenched, which cannot be obliterated in me. It's, say, when I'm an alcoholic, a complete alcoholic, and I'm like powerless against my passion, against my addiction. I cannot do anything. I just have to drink all the time, right? But still, inside me, there is something that can potentially overcome this passion, this addiction. Something that can change me, that I can use, that I can rely upon in order to change myself, to overcome my own nature, to overcome my own, this addiction. And this is to avtexousion. Literally, the word means the self-power of the human beings to rule upon themselves. It is a sort of freedom that can always be enacted, can always, on which I can always rely in order to overcome myself. In addition to this freedom, there is eleftheria. Eleftheria is not something which is intrinsic, which cannot be taken away from me. Eleftheria is a sort of freedom that depends on me, how I use it. It's my state of freedom. Say, when I'm an alcoholic, I'm not free from my passion, from my addiction. I am dependent on alcohol. Therefore, my eleftheria, freedom in the sense of eleftheria, is reduced. It's minimal. It's really small, or maybe non-existent. I'm not free from, taking alcohol, being intoxicated, and the kind of level of freedom in the sense of eleftheria reduces, becomes really small. At the same time, the level of avtexousion remains the same. This capacity of overcoming myself potentially remains the same. So the fathers of the church actually differentiated between these two kinds of eleftheria. Eleftheria as avtexousion, and freedom as avtexousion, and freedom as eleftheria. And it's interesting where they put the concept of evil, where they place the concept of freedom. After they liberated, human nature from, and the entire world from necessity of being divided between evil and bad things, and after they identified that evil is nested in the human freedom, then they began thinking where exactly in the human freedom is evil. And it is possible to say that that freedom is certainly the place, the house for evil, that hosts the evil, and which compartment in the house, which room in the house is the place for evil. For them, the avtexousion, the capacity of overcoming any condition, any state of the human nature, per se is good, because it is created by God. It is for them, was the image of God in the human beings. Some of the fathers, like Gregory of Nyssa, for instance, he believed this avtexousion, this kind of freedom, makes human beings, they use the word isotheon, equal to God. because we have to aptexousion, this rule over ourselves, but the potentiality of ruling on ourselves. We are equal to God. And I think I need to, right, already to come to the conclusions. Yeah, I'm coming to the conclusions. And this capacity to rule over ourselves, to aptexousion, makes us equal to God, which means it cannot be ontologically evil. But the way how we use it, how it functions, conditions whether we do evil things or we do good things. And then it is not evil that is nested, that it is not, the evil is not identifiable with the aptexousion. Aptexousion is not evil as such, but the function of the aptexousion produces either evil or good things. And this function, the eleftheria, you can say that eleftheria, this freedom in the sense of eleftheria, is the function of the aptexousion. And eleftheria then reflects the reduction of eleftheria when the amount of eleftheria becomes lesser than it used to be previously. Then we can speak about the production of evil. Evil is less eleftheria. Goodness is more eleftheria, in the sense of exactly of eleftheria. When I free from myself, when I free from evil around me, when I'm free from the fear that can haunt me, when I am free from the world around me, when I'm free from the circumstances that surround me, that is good. That is this function is which is a function of aptexousion. The amount of eleftheria measures the amount of goodness in myself, the moral goodness of a personality. So that's about this distinction between eleftheria and aptexousion, which I believe is very helpful to understand moral philosophy, if you want, especially the moral philosophy as it had been produced by the fathers of the Church, and how it is connected with the concept of evil. So that's about these two basic categories, the big categories, eleftheria and aptexousion, freedom in several senses, evil. And as I said, there are many implications of these categories. Still, ontological interpretation of evil exists, and it still constitutes a huge social problem. And as I said in the beginning, I would conclude with this: we still face the implications of this ontological interpretation of evil in our social life, and the phenomena which really haunt modern societies, like racism, nationalism, misogynism, sexism, all sorts of isms, can be interpreted from the perspective of the interpretation, ontological interpretation of evil. Also, reductionist interpretation of freedom is not helpful either. When freedom is perceived as a multiplicity of choices, like the way we face supermarkets. When we go to the supermarket, and the more choices we have in the supermarket, the better it is believed to be for us. It is certainly a reduction of the freedom, at least as we know it in the Christian tradition, the tradition of the Christian Neoplatonism, where freedom is something more ontologically important in the sense of aptexousion, and also morally important in the sense of eleftheria. So I think those big questions, which were very widely discussed in the period of late antiquity, then in the Middle Ages, they're still relevant for our time. And I wanted to bring them to our discussion. Maybe we could reflect on this, and we could do it properly in the Q&A. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your inspiring lecture. Now we're open the floor for questions. Please.
Hello and welcome. My name is Vladislav.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to talk more about ontology, because I think morality or immorality is just an offspring, it's just a branch from ontology.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks to me that if you say that the problem of evil is in morality, in that category, it is impossible if ontology is good by itself.
Mm-hmm.
If ontology is absolutely good and equal to God, and in a sense that absolutely is good, and that the free will is the part which move right or left.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like to ask you some questions about ontology.
Right,
So,
sure.
is it possible to have equality between evil and death, mortality?
Yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have our beliefs and mythology,
Mm-hmm.
in some sense, that evil is entering this world through Adam and Eve.
Mm-hmm.
So mortality is entering this world through Adam and Eve, through original sin.
Yes.
But it was something normal to think in 5th century or 6th century, but now, when you have discoveries about a lot of beings before human
Right.
came on Earth, you have evidence of mortality hundreds and thousands years before Adam and Eve actually showed up on this scene. So mortality and death was something ontologically present in this world before the dawn of man and the original sin. So that's one.
It's a very good question. Very good question. Yeah. Well, it's a very good question indeed. Well, certainly from the biological perspective, from the perspective of biology, death is good, because death produces it instigates the process of selection, right? When weaker animals die, it means that healthy animals survive, and it contributes, to the general development of of a particular species, right, of animals. So death is good because it helps, it facilitates exactly the evolution and the development of the species. But we as humans, we understand that if we take this approach, then we can justify, Nazism, genocides, and stuff. And for us, death is bad still, and therefore people who kill, they are immoral beings who have to be, put to jail, or in some countries executed, and so forth. And we consider killing of one human being by another as an ultimate evil. Hence is our perception of genocides, of Holocaust, and so forth, right? Also, from our perspective, even from the perspective of the secular society, the society that has completely embraced Darwinism and evolution, and who has embraced the findings of science regarding the pre-existence of thousands of generations of deaths before even human beings appeared on the surface of Earth. Anything that threatens human life with death is considered to be the ultimate evil, right? In our society, everything which is a threat to human life, to humanity, is ultimate evil. This is quite in contrast to Christianity, the traditional Christianity, even though for modern Christianity, I would say, yes, it is also the same. And I myself, I believe firmly that it is really a very immoral and evil thing to threaten death, to threaten someone with death. But in the Middle Ages, for instance, where the sanity, the soundness of human soul was regarded superior to the soundness of the human body, death was not so dangerous, was not so bad, as far as it could contribute to the salvation of soul. That's why we had the phenomenon of martyrs. People who sacrificed their life for the sake of their soul. For them, death was not an ultimate evil. The ultimate evil for them was the death of the soul. So it's quite a paradox that for people, modern secular people with a secular mind, for whom, as following your kind of the line of your question, death is not necessarily evil because it drives actually the evolution and things. The death of the human beings is an ultimate evil. While for the Christians previously, it was really not the ultimate evil. It was bad, certainly, but it was not the ultimate bad. So it's one of the paradoxes that I'd like to answer, with which I would like to answer to your questions. And speaking about yes, the ontological dimension of death. Death is an ontological phenomenon. It's happening. Well, because we can go to the funeral service and we can touch the dead body, right? This is very real. It's touchable. Therefore, it is ontological, and we can smell death. We can see death. We can touch death. It's something really evil. If you go to the battlefield, you can be completely surrounded by death, right? It's one of the most. It's an ontological experience that has been inspirational for the modern literature. If you take literature describing the war, the battlefields and stuff, the experience of death there, it is very real. It is very ontological. So it is indeed ontological. But again, what is the moral charge of this ontological kind of phenomenon thing? One thing is that when people die in their deathbed at their homes, surrounded by their relatives, when people die and they want to die, in the sense it's not about suicide. It's not even about euthanasia, which is another kind of aspect of death. Of course, we can discuss a lot about euthanasia. When people expect death to come as something good, as a liberation, there is such a thing as Christian death, when people just, they come at terms with death. They receive death as something good, even for them, because they are released, they can go to God. When they feel not necessarily prepared they hope for the mercy of God, and they receive death as a chance to reunite with God. In this sense, death can be good, in a sense. Then it can be death exactly caused by the human violence. That death is certainly bad, because death per se is bad, but also the additional evil of being killed by a wrong choice of another person, which is immoral, which is evil per se. This choice is evil, and it adds to the evil of death of a human being when the life is taken from someone. So I think there is a moral variety of deaths. On the battlefield, in the genocide, by violent killing, natural death, or the death which is the death of reconciled hope with God.
But my question is, sorry, just practically, if it's possible, to put it directly. Was God the one who created death, who created mortal ontology, some completely different being in opposite to himself? Because if we go back to fundamental ontology, like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, there's a radically it's distinction between those two ontologies. It's in some way dualism between beings of God and beings of human and animals and plants and everything else. So in that sense,
I understand the question.
I think that Christian ontology is it confesses that ontology, the created ontology, it has evil in its essence. It has an evil. It infected with evil, with death, and that's the root how morality can work.
That's a very good question. Yes, I understand. I got it. Well, there are two, at least, interpretations in the Christian theology of the phenomenon of death in the animal kingdom, because, well, human beings are part of the animal kingdom as well, partially at least. According to the one interpretation, that death did not exist at all. So animals and human beings didn't die before the fall of Adam and Eve, right? That is one interpretation. And this interpretation was quite popular in the antiquity, in the Middle Ages, essentially until Darwin discovered the evolution theory, and then until they discovered the generations of really the million years of pre-existence of nature in the 19th century. Before human beings. And this was a shock to the Christian interpretation of death, certainly. But then the Christian theology, I think, somehow adapted to these discoverings, to these scientific findings. And they say now, and I think I share this opinion, that indeed death pre-existed as a natural phenomenon, and per se it was not evil. It was just a natural way of things. But it does mean that the human beings, at least, we don't know whether animals died in paradise. Probably they did. Well, the findings of paleontology, they say that yes, all those things, they died.
There's teeth marks, and you have signs of massacre.
Exactly.
With dinosaurs.
Exactly. We know they died. Right now, this problem is solved. No question. Right? They died, and this death, we probably should not perceive it in the terms of moral kind of theology of after fall period as something as morally evil. The question is whether Adam and Eve were to die. Here, there is an interesting differentiation. Because some theologians, even in the period of late antiquity, they believed that Adam and Eve were destined to die. Immortality was already embedded in their nature. But they had grace of God, additional grace of God, that kept them alive. You remember this tree of life, which is mentioned in the Bible. So some theologians interpreted this tree of life as the source of life imbued in their existence, in their nature, which did not allow the natural death to overcome over them. And after they were deprived of this grace as a result of fall, they just began dying in the natural way, just like other animals. That is one of an interpretation which actually goes back to Augustine somehow, and some Eastern fathers also follow this interpretation. I think it makes sense. It is compatible with these biological and paleontological theories and findings.
Okay,
For example, to say that
we will continue this.
Some other things.
Okay, thank you for your lecture. My question would concern this hypothetical issue. Can this ethical understanding of evil account for anything that is beyond individual will? I'm concerned about context, institutions, in one sense, if evil is only a result of individual will, how can we explain or account for, concentration camps and those are, the Hague Tribunal or the Hague and Nuremberg, they were full of very nice people who led a very moral life, who listened to classical music, who went
they were faithful to their wives and families, or they loved their kids, children.
Went to church and so on and so forth. Never did anything morally despicable in their life. If you want, and if you, I'm sure you're familiar with Hannah Arendt and the narrative of evil, and her interpretation of Eichmann as a bureaucrat, maybe without individual will per se. That would be.
Yeah, that exactly the moral interpretation of evil is an answer to this question. Because if we perceive evil as ontological, say those people like Hitler, for instance, or Goebbels, right? They are ontologically evil. They are like demons, right? They are not humans even. They are like demons. Then, if we interpret them as ontologically evil kind of human beings, that whatever they did had to be evil per se. Well, Hitler in this sense would have to have, you know, fried children for his breakfast, and would, you know, listen to Rammstein, I don't know, and would be, you know, everything that he would have. Well, I like Rammstein, no, just like an example. Some things I like from Rammstein, but I mean, whatever they did, it had to be evil per se, if they were ontologically evil. Because what is ontological evil cannot produce anything good. So concentration camps and you know, genocide and Shoah certainly would be explained by this ontological interpretation of evil, that they were ontologically bad, therefore they inspired people to kill, you know, millions of others. But everything else that they did had to be evil per se. But it was not. Because Hitler, he painted nice, you know, pictures, not very much talented, but still he had, you know, aesthetical feelings. He liked his wife, whatever it was, Eva Braun. Goebbels also liked his children. Probably he was humane to his, you know, closest circle. They were nice people, and that's exactly because they were not ontologically evil, because they made some wrong moral choices regarding some particular issues. And those issues could be institutionalized, because a choice of a person can be institutionalized. People can create even institutions of evil, like concentration camps, right? And especially when they inspire other people, and when the choices of millions of others coincide regarding one cause, they can produce this machinery of killings, as Nazis did. But it was just one particular issue that they applied evil. Other things, yes, exactly, they were nice people, probably. If we met them in the street or in a conversation, we would love them, if we didn't know what they did.
Okay, we have one question here.
Well, thank you for the talk. When you talked about will, as free will, as a divine element in human beings, you were talking about strength of will, the ability to overcome passions,
right,
and so on. But I'm interested in the weakness of will. I would like to hear more about the relation between that sort of will and the weakness of will. And because weakness of will is a very important phenomenon,
yeah,
it seems to give human beings some special dignity and special kind of freedom.
Yeah.
It seems that we are more free because we have the capacity to do wrong. And it seems that when we do good, because of that, it's more important.
Yeah.
It has more weight. So,
yeah, yeah. Yes, not just weakness of will. They speak, well, in the sense of Caput, about weakness of God as a source of weakness of human beings as well. Something that should be appreciated. So, after Caputo began speaking about weakness of God, we began appreciating weakness not as a deficiency of the human being, but probably as an advantage of the human beings. It's a good question. It's a big question, right, to discuss. I would probably say now very briefly that the acknowledgement of the weakness of will is essentially and effectively an acknowledgement of the reality. We deny weakness of will, and we want people to be strong and powerful when we are driven by ideas. When we are driven by an ideal perception, concepts, what a human being should be, must be. This is our idea about an ideal human being, and we want all real beings to correspond, to fit, to align with this concept of ours about the human beings. Those who cannot fit this idea, we can end up in sending them to concentration camps. That's exactly what happened under the totalitarian regimes, under communism and Nazism. They had a certain perception of the human being, an idealistic perception of the human being. Probably only a few corresponded to this perception. The majority did not. And because the leadership and the ideologies did not acknowledge the weakness of the human being, of the human will, they could not, all of them, well, actually the majority, or probably none of them, could correspond to this ideal. They established this system of oppression and persecution in order to get rid of the people, the weakest people in the society, as it were. So ideology as an ideal perception of what a human being should be, on the one hand, it helps, well, it encourages or forces sometimes violently forces people to correspond to this ideal. And it also produces those who fail to correspond to this ideal perception of the human being. They send them to concentration camps, so to say, or extinguish them. In this sense, the acknowledgement of the weakness of the human being is contrary to ideology. It is an acknowledgement of the reality. We should not be driven by our ideas of what a human being should be. We have to acknowledge what a human being is in reality. It is an acknowledgement of reality, and that's why I think it is very helpful. It is good to speak about weakness, because it is like speaking about reality.
Okay, Jelena.
Thank you very much. Don't you think that maybe this distinction between the ontological and ethical approach to the origin of the evil is ontological in itself? It's very mechanical and Manichaean in itself, because on one hand there's a perception that the evil exists, and by touching it somehow become evil. On the other hand, there's this perception that the evil resides in our free will, whereas of course our free will is the way we use it is pretty much shaped by the material conditions in which we live. So that's, I think that there's some allusions to some of those questions about the way we are all conditioned by institutions, by larger societies, by material infrastructure. This duality somehow is not sustainable anymore, because it is it's the context that will eventually determine our deeds as being evil or good. Also, I think there's a lot of conflation between morality and ethics. I mean, because also in this exchange between Alexander and I've noticed this, they listen to classical music, had kids and families. So what? These are not features of a good person. One who has a family and kids and listens to classical music is not a good. That doesn't mean anything.
Right.
And on the other hand, I don't know, people who don't have kids or listen to Rammstein are bad.
Yeah. Exactly.
So it's not really, why are we so surprised that someone who listens to classical music is capable of doing murder? That's nonsensical. And also, I think that we should ditch the examples of Holocaust and concentration camps because they're way too easy. But what about French Revolution? What about October Revolution? Are they good deeds or bad deeds? You know, are killings sometimes justified?
Yeah, certainly it's very complicated, and what I described it was just a very general framework, and certainly it does not cannot contain all the cases and the instances that you've described. You're absolutely right, and a question which is related to your question is the question of determinism, social determinism. To what extent our choices are conditioned by the circumstances around us. Moreover, the question is much larger, and probably the moral explanation of evil is ontological per se as such. And this paradoxical kind of conclusion may come from neuroscience, the science of brain, our brain. I had many conversations with a friend of mine who is a neuroscientist in New York. He's a great scholar, and he's also a theologian. And it's a dilemma for himself. He studies brain, and he knows that our choices, our decisions, are often influenced, by the distance between neurons in our brain. The way how the blood circulates in our brain can define the way how we make our choices. and they measure it. I mean, it's scientifically proven that it is so. So the question is whether our moral choices, even the most intimate choices that we make, the most important moral choices that we make, are really not conditioned by the speed of blood in our brain. That is a big question. I don't know a solution to this problem.
You're certainly familiar with Schopenhauer's.
Yeah.
Yeah. It says something similar, that we are always motivated on some level in our beings. We are not completely free to decide.
Yeah.
So this is one part of, and they measure, I think, 8 seconds, but the critic says that it was basic decisions.
Yeah.
We never say it's about 8 seconds before the person decided to choose. But who knows if we are free at all?
Yes, it's really a big problem from the perspective of Christian theology, at least. Yes, we believe that human beings are not determinable by the circumstances, even by their bodies, by the circumstances of their bodies. And still, it is, even from the perspective of science, they don't have a final decision. They don't insist that the circulation of blood in our brain defines everything that we decide. They don't insist on it, but they say that it certainly influences our decisions. To what extent? It's a good question. So I think it's a good question for the discussion between science and theology and philosophy, which has not been solved yet.
More questions?
Or from the perspective of Christian position, if absence of love is the evil per se?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Yeah. Well, again, what is love? Some people say it's a chemical process. To some extent, it is, certainly because, well, the endomorphins they're produced by our bodies and so forth. But can we agree that love is just chemistry in our the chemistry of hormones? I think, well, at least people who are in love, they would not agree with that. And again, there are certainly there are abuses of love. You can say that domestic violence is an excess of love. When a husband comes to home out of jealousy and beats his wife, well, it is love to some extent, but it is a very kind of, yes, it is a very bad deviation of love. Well, in the Christian theology, they would speak about, they would speak about passions as a deviation of the original good intention of the human being. Like they said that a human being is supposed to have love, to love God, to love his or her neighbor, and this is a good kind of intention. But it can be deviated, can be distorted, and addressed a wrong addressee, like love to money or love to power. Those are affections which went astray, wrong way, and they should be corrected. So, yes, domestic violence can be interpreted as a distortion of love. It is a distorted love. Or rape can be interpreted as a distorted love. And certainly it needs to be corrected, and it is morally very bad. Yeah, that would be my answer.
The last question.
Excellent presentation. I didn't quite understand. Do you actually stand in the position that the origin of evil is our free will to choose between good and evil? Because if it is, then we could imagine a situation in which there was no evil, so we wouldn't be able to choose between good and evil. It means that actually maybe God is himself responsible for the existence of evil.
Yeah. Well, I would distinguish two kind of ways of interpretation of evil. To put it in as an image, imagine a car that goes and smashes into a wall. There could be two interpretations of this accident. One interpretation is that car has smashed into the wall because it is faulty. Something is wrong with its engine. Another interpretation is that the driver is not skillful enough. The driver made mistakes. The car is okay. The driver is not okay. So I go with the interpretation that the driver is not okay. It's not the car. So that would be, and the former interpretation, the car smashing into the wall because of a faulty engine, is exactly the ontological interpretation of evil, I believe. And the moral one is that when the driver is to be blamed for the accident. I don't see that it puts blame on God. Actually, I think this interpretation gives a solution to the problem of theodicia, that whether God is the source of evil. Because if evil is interpreted ontologically, then God has to be blamed. And
I mean, we could blame him, theoretically speaking.
Yeah.
Why not? Because we could imagine a situation in which there were no incapable drivers at all. Why is there incapability in the human beings in the first place?
Yeah.
Who is responsible for this? Is it only the Adam and Eve, or someone else?
Well, the Christian theology gives an explanation that it's because of the fall, the original faulty decision of the human beings in the paradise, why they were expelled. We understand that it's more complicated. Well, the reality is more complicated, of course. And still, I believe, even if we disregard the fall and this Christian and biblical, Jewish as well, interpretation of the fall, we still can rely on the human choice as the ultimate source of goods and evils. The possibility, I believe that the possibility of making mistake is important because it creates a possibility of making right choices. If we eliminate the possibility of mistake from the human beings, we essentially eliminate the possibility of right choices from the human beings. Then morality is flattened. Then morality doesn't exist at all. Morality exists only when there is a possibility of immorality. And God has created this possibility in the human, I believe, from the Christian perspective. I'm a Christian, so I have to include God to this picture of, and
I think I'm also Christian, but
right.
Questioning some of the basic
Right.
principles.
Right. And I believe that God has created this possibility of evil, not the evil per se, but the possibility of evil in order to create the possibility of right choices. Because freedom is about the possibility of choosing.
You said recently, I mean, just half an hour ago, that freedom is about after
Yes.
which we normally describe or translate as self-determination.
Yes, exactly. And that
you're saying that freedom is actually about freedom of will.
No, that's exactly what I mean. That after is the most important part in the human being that was given to God, from God to the human beings. Essentially, this isotheon, remember, the capacity of being equal to God, which was described by Gregory of Nyssa, applies to after. This makes us equal to God.
What's icon in human being after?
It is the image of God per se in the human being. The core of the image of God in the human being is to after this possibility of self-determination, which is not determined by anything else.
Not even by God.
Not even by God, exactly. Yeah.
Well, we think that we should stop here and maybe continue this conversation in službeni glasnik. Okay, well, thank you once more for your lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Now it's a question. We have like two closes. One is